When we get to the end of the road, we find that there is nothing waiting there. There's not even a relief. Just the same emptiness that we were saying goodbye to on our way out. At the end of this journey, there was no euphoria, no tears, no burst of joy. The end of the road, dry and obvious as the result of a mathematical equation. The balance, eventually, always comes out to zero. That's a quote from today's guest, talking about his crossing of the Zagros Mountains in Iran. This is episode 195 with Lukasz Supergan, where we talk about his recent winter crossing of Iceland. Welcome back to the Pursuit Zone. I'm Paul Schmid, and I interview explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. Let's begin the show, and let me introduce my guest. His passion is undertaking expeditions through the mountains, thousands of kilometers long, on foot and usually alone. These journeys provide an opportunity to look within and ponder life's most profound questions. For more than 2 decades, he has walked over 20,000 kilometers through mountain ranges in Europe and Asia. In 2004, he did a first-ever solo thru-hike of the Carpathian Mountains, and in 2014, he hiked through the Zagros Mountains in Iran. Inspired by a summer adventure in Iceland, he returned to Iceland in 2020 to complete an east-to-west crossing in winter. You can learn more at his website, lucassupergan.com. Łukasz Supergan, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Lukasz, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Warsaw, Poland, in capital, and I spent most of my life, or all my life, in big city, but of course, except mountain trips and some traveling. The longest time I've been outside of my country was 2 years, and that was my longest adventure. 2 years in Asia that I would spend, well, I can say that circumnavigating the biggest continent of the world. But beside of that, I'm always coming back to Poland, and I grew up in Warsaw, and I just moved from that town just a few weeks ago.
Did you go to university?
Yes, and I've been studying environmental protection, so I consider myself a biologist and geographer in the same time.
I'm wondering how you fund these big adventures. What do you do as a regular job?
I used to have a regular job. I mean, the typical 9-to-5 job. You can imagine me sitting behind the desk, but it was not really ordinary job. I've been working in a Greenpeace Poland office, which is an environmental organization, and my job was toxics and agriculture campaigner. And of course, it sounds maybe a little crazy, but in fact, it's a regular job for non-governmental sector, but still job and still work in the office. And I started to work there in 2006. I finished in 2010. And since 2010, I didn't really work in the office, at least not regularly, but I've been doing, pretty different things, but all the time they were not regular, really.
How did you first become interested in traveling through the mountains?
Well, that was absolutely easy. I think I had that from the first trips I used to undertake with my mom. I remember being 8 years old, and that was the moment when we started our first adventure. And of course, I remember being, as a kid, crying during our first trip, having very bad equipment, having very bad weather, absolutely no experience. And of course, you can imagine a deep winter. We started our first adventure in deep winter, and a little boy with his mom walking, sometimes crying through the snow. But during next years, I started regularly traveling to the mountains in southern Poland. And every September, especially, we used to spend 1 or 2 weeks with my mom and her friends only in the mountains. And that started to be kind of, routine for us. Since I've 10 years old, I've been regularly traveling to the Polish mountains. But during that time, they were strictly and only Polish mountains, not abroad. We didn't travel abroad. And I'm sure that from these small adventures, I started my big ones.
What do you consider to be your first big hike or your first big adventure?
Well, depends how you count long distance, because when you say in Europe, or especially in Poland, when you say that you've been walking 100 kilometers or 100 miles, many people would say, oh, that's a long distance. But take a look on, I don't know, Appalachian Trail or Pacific Crest Trail. They have more than 3,000 miles, which means you cannot compare long distance in Poland and in US. But my first lonely and absolutely lonely trips was about 300 miles in Polish Carpathians. That was just travel, just a hike, which took me 2 weeks and a half, made during my studies, like out of curiosity, how it would be to walk alone. And that was a brilliant adventure. I really walked alone for the first time ever without any companion. That was the very first lonely and also long experience. But after that trip, I asked myself the question, okay, I just thru-hiked the Polish Carpathians, but where these mountains began, really? Where they finish? Because I knew that, of course, there are some Carpathian mountains in Slovakia, but is there anything else on more to the east, Ukraine? I was studying environmental protection, and I had quite a lot of geography during my studies. And I had no idea where my mountains are really beginning. So I took a look on the map of Middle and Eastern Europe. I took a look on the Carpathian map, and that was the moment that changed my life, because I realized, wow, that's a big one. And in just 1 minute, I decided, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to thru-hike the whole Carpathians range from the beginning till the end. And I think that was the beginning. After 3 years from that decision, I started to hiking Carpathians, which are about 1,300 kilometers long. And that was my first really, really long distance hiking in 2004.
And that one took 93 days, and you repeated it in 2013, 9 years later, and this time you were able to do it in 65 days. So in those 9 years, what changed? What did you learn that allowed you to take off that 28 days?
Well, I was much older, much more experienced. That was the first one. My first Carpathians thru-hike in 2004 was also learning how to hike, really. I took quite bad equipment. My tent was leaking. My backpack was too heavy and uncomfortable. My cooking equipment was really absolutely crappy. And I didn't really know what kind of food to buy to make it easily in the mountains. So I was buying food that I couldn't use later on. After 5 weeks, I destroyed my cooking stove, which means from that moment until the border of Poland, I was walking stoveless, which was absolutely uncomfortable, but I didn't have choice. And I forgot to say that I was losing my trail at least 2-3 times a week, which means I was really an experienced hiker, and I was learning all this, huge knowledge that I should have on my way. Well, that was pretty painful, but that's how it works. And after this trip, I gained pretty big experience. I started to walk in the mountains again in Poland, but in a much more conscious way. And I also started to wonder how to downsize the size of my backpack. And in 2013, I came back because I felt that these mountains, this trip was some kind of unresolved fight. I was fighting, really, in 2004. And I wanted to do that again, but this time being calm and just walking. no fighting. What was the difference? Well, much lighter backpack. I choose my gear much more efficiently. I downsized my backpack from 100 liters to 55 and from 50 pounds to probably 30, maximum 30. That was a tremendous difference. And it means I increased also my daily distance by probably 8 to 10 kilometers. I had more experience. I didn't get lost that often. And even if I did, I could easily navigate back to the trail. And last but not least, the Thru-hike in 2013 was about 200 kilometers shorter. I walked more on the inner side of Carpathians, but still inside the mountains. That made the second crossing in 2013 not only shorter, but much more easier. And it gave me much more fun, I have to say.
Wow, 100-liter backpack.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question. You mentioned that you took the wrong food. So can you give me an example of what is the wrong type of food?
For example, kind of Romanian pasta that you have to cook 20 minutes, or Romanian polenta, which is a corn that you also cook 20 minutes and it's still hard. It was all the time, the lack of experience in choosing food, choosing equipment, choosing the right place to spend the night, and so on and so on. So even the food was like a part of experience during this trip. Right now, it's one of the things that I put really big attention into.
In 2020, you are set to do this crossing of Iceland. Why did you choose Iceland?
That's a good question. I don't really remember. And I have to tell you that if you ask me, how do I choose my destinations? I really rely on intuition. I have no key, or I don't have any rule how to choose where to go. Of course, I could choose some kind of bucket list, like a Triple Crown in US. That's a very good example. What I see right now is I feel really well in the places which are empty. It doesn't really matter if it's a desert or if it's a volcanic wasteland like Iceland. I really like places when I can feel alone, and Iceland is definitely the place where you can feel alone. Also, when I was thinking about my next Thru-hikes, I get some information about people walking across Iceland. Iceland crossing is maybe these words are a little bit too bold, but it's a kind of holy grail for some trekkers around the world. And every year somebody is doing that, of course, in summer. So I thought myself, all right, that might be interesting. And the first idea was just to cross Iceland, nothing more. What I learned from the reports of previous trips were most of the people are walking north-south. And I decided to go east-west, which is longer, a little bit more difficult, but gave me the overview of all the landscapes of Iceland. And I really like this trip.
Yes, approximately 750 kilometers, that distance, and it was going to take you 5 to 6 weeks. How much time did you have to spend planning?
I think about 1 year. Exactly 1 year earlier, a friend of mine, also the Polish guy from Warsaw, was trying to break a speed record for north-south crossing. He didn't manage, but still, he did a really fantastic trip. And I was attending his lecture where he was explaining the nature of Iceland and the nature of the crossing itself. After that, we met a few times. I asked plenty of questions, and I think that was a crucial moment. I started to believe that I can do that. I realized what should I know and what should I prepare to do this kind of crossing. And I think it took me about 1 year. Of course, this 1 year was also filled with writing, giving public speeches, and so on and so on. But I spent about 1 year of planning the Iceland crossing.
Before the 2020 crossing, you were in Iceland in 2016 to do, I think also, was it an east to west crossing in 2016?
Yes.
And what did you learn from that summertime experience that you were able to then use in the winter?
First thing first, I get familiar with a very empty nature of Iceland. I learned that I'm not afraid of loneliness. I also learned what kind of gear would work in this sometimes hostile environment. Most of the Iceland is a part of Arctic, so the conditions can be really tough even during the summer. I also learned the shape of the river network. I also learned how to navigate along the paths and roads on the highlands. What difficulties lie in front of you. Knowing the difficulties that you have in front of you gives you a big advantage, which means even just remembering things from 2016 was very, very useful 4 years later in winter. Also, the navigation is easier. And when you just remember the profile of your path, you can plan how you will use your strength during the next day, next week, etc. So in this way, the summer crossing helped me tremendously during the winter one, 3.5 years later.
During this time between the summer and the winter adventure, what are you doing to train to get yourself ready for the winter crossing?
I've been doing regular trainings. There is a kind of stereotype that to be good in the mountains, you have to run. Well, I was doing some running, but what is crucial during the Arctic trip like this one, you are pulling a sled, which has about, let's say, 100 pounds. And you're using the same muscles that you would use during high mountain climbing, which means I was doing my trainings in the mountains, walking or running, but strictly in the mountains. And if being in Warsaw, I was using a treadmill, which was elevated 15, 20 degrees to simulate mountain conditions. That was the great training because after that, I was able to pull my sled uphill, sometimes on a very, very long sections. And so that kind of training was perfect.
What kind of budget did you need to do an expedition like this?
I think it's not that big, like considering the cost of, for example, Greenland or North or South Pole expeditions. I can tell you exactly, I've spent about $2,000 for this trip, but not counting additional gear. For example, if I had, for example, ski equipment or sled, I would pay just for getting there, for accommodation, for food and fuel, for my, for example, my Spot Messenger subscription, for internet connection. I needed to buy the mobile phone card, of course, insurance. So all of this, that would be about $2,000 US. But you have to add to that amount the cost of gear I had to buy before, which was skis and boots, skiing boots, sled, new expedition tent, satellite phone rental, and some small electronic equipment like power banks. And but please do not laugh. I spent the rest of my Icelandic kronas at the end of the trip for kind of thank you party for my friends in Reykjavik because they helped me a lot during this trip. So together it was about $3,000 everything.
I think that's a good price.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I mean, for an adventure like that, it's a very good price. Of course, you have advantage that you don't have to, for example, hire the very expensive transportation like Greenland or South Pole. You don't have to have very special insurance, which also costs a lot, like in Greenland or Antarctica, and so on and so on. And like the red tape on all these formalities pretty much doesn't exist on Iceland when you want to cross it, either summer or winter. So really, you only cover the costs that are essential during this trip. And I think this $2,000 I spent exclusively on the trip is really decent price. Of course, it depends how you look at it. For average American, this price is something different than for average person in Poland. But still, comparing to many polar adventures that are much more expensive, this was really affordable.
Well, let's, while we're on this topic, let's talk about your equipment that you mentioned. Why don't you tell me first about your sledge?
Well, I was using a very simple Paris pulk, which is made from rigid plastic. Unfortunately, it's not strong enough, and I learned it by heart during this trip. I bought my sledge used, and it already did a few hundred kilometers on Spitsbergen and on Iceland. And unfortunately, after a few days, it started to break. I was really lucky that a friend of mine from Reykjavik could send me the new sled, and I was able to walk along the last possible valley, 25 kilometers down and 25 up, to pick up my new sled. And from that time, I was carrying, or rather pulling, 2 pairs, changing them like a sandwich up and down. But after all these hundreds of kilometers on the Iceland highlands, both of them were destroyed. I mean, I didn't even take them back to Poland.
It was the rocks that destroyed them?
And ice, both of them. Unfortunately, I started to have really warm weather on the beginning of my trip. It lasted just 2 days, but the temperatures were like +4, +5 Celsius, which means the snow started to melt. And the rocks and the gravel, mostly gravel, because rocks you could bypass, you could go around the boulders and rocks. Unfortunately, also plenty of gravel started to go out from the snow, and this was something that I could not avoid. Unfortunately, the few days during the trip, and also 2 or 3 days just at the end of the trip, just before leaving Highlands, I used to have plenty of gravel instead of snow, and that made my sledge completely destroyed.
What are you using for skis?
That was very, very good choice. I used Alpina backcountry skis. It's Discovery 80, which are pretty wide. They are wide enough and good enough to walk even in deep powder, and I like them very much. And I also put the Rotefella Magnum bindings. And these are the Nordic bindings, but are very rigid and trustworthy. They are used on polar expeditions, so I trusted them, and they are still right now, both skis and bindings, in very good shape.
And do you use skins?
Yes, absolutely yes. They were essential. If I could walk on the soft snow, the skis themselves would be maybe enough. But while pulling 100 pounds at the beginning and pulling it sometimes uphill, the skins were absolutely essential. And I was using the same kind of skins that you are using for touring skis in the high mountains. They were pretty much the same.
So you spent about a year planning this, and how did you decide on your route?
That was pretty easy. About 50% of my route, especially on the highlands, I was planning to walk the same way like 2016. Of course, it's a big advantage to know your route before. The things that were different were the beginning and at the end. In 2016, I decided to connect 2 easternmost and westernmost points, which is Cape Gerbir and Bjargtangar in western fjords. This time I chose the shorter route, and I started in Serdisfjordur, which is the small town on east coast of Iceland. And I decided to finish in a special place, which is Snæfellsnes Peninsula. It's this very thin and long peninsula that goes from the west coast. And if you maybe remember the tale of Jules Verne about traveling to the center of the earth, it's that volcano at the end of this peninsula. I also knew that I will have about 50 kilometers of coastal zone at the beginning and about 180 kilometers at the end, which also will be coastal zone, which is easier. And in that area, I could walk without sled, without skis, just with my backpack. The rest of my road was on highlands, and big part of that road I choose to follow the path I knew from summer expedition.
Now, you had to make a decision on which month to start in, because you could start earlier in the winter, maybe December, maybe January, but I think you started in February. Why did you make that decision?
That was pretty hard decision. I mean, like the most important point was I wanted to do all the expedition fit into a calendar winter. That was the rule number one. I could, of course, start in December, close to New Year Eve or even Christmas. But I knew that December and January might be tricky because of weather and because of very, very short day. And I also get information that in February, weather should be more stable. Should be. It means you cannot really be sure. So I was counting on my luck. And I have to say that, like, I could try to do that in January. But seeing what happened in January, like the Icelanders had one of the most powerful storms in that month that ever hit the Iceland. So I was thinking, really, if I'm not crazy, maybe I'm doing a wrong thing. Maybe I should postpone 1 year or even completely drop that plan. But there is a kind of saying that fortune favors the bold. I think that's the proper English way to say that. Sometimes you just have to make a decision. Like the day you decide to go will be your lucky day, which means there will be no better day than today to make a decision. So I was absolutely counting on my luck, and that was a good calculation. February was, in my opinion, really good month for walking. It wasn't too warm because in March snow started to disappear slowly, and it wasn't too stormy as February. That was a perfect moment.
You have your decision, you have your starting date, and I guess you fly into Reykjavik, and then from Reykjavik, how do you get to the starting point?
Well, first, my friends picked me up from the airport, and I spent 3 days organizing things in the capital. There was really bad weather when we were driving from the airport. So again, all of us had plenty of doubts, but I told myself I will do that. From the capital, it took me, I think, 24 hours with 2 buses and hitchhiking to go to Seyðisfjörður. Like the public transport of Iceland is like ridiculously expensive and it's not really frequent. That's why it took me 24 hours. But considering the conditions, we were driving in really deep winter, it was pretty okay. So after 24 hours, I reached the Seyðisfjörður, the east coast, about 700 kilometers away. And that was the point when I started to hike, basically.
In the U.S., on some of the hikes that you do, you need to get like some sort of a permit. Do you need a similar thing in Iceland, or can you just go and start walking?
You just go and that's all. There is no any kind of permit system like in the US for national parks, or I've been reading about the permit system on Pacific Crest Trail, for example, which is sometimes complicated for people. Also, you don't really pay for nothing. Like in Nepal, Himalaya, you pay just for the permit to go for the trekking or go to some kind of summit. Absolutely not. There is a rule on Iceland that most of the nature places are available for free. There are exceptions, but not many of them. So you don't really need any permit. But there is one thing I would really like to stress. If you do something like that, it would be really wise to write an email or pay a visit to the search and rescue team in capital. Tell them where you go and ask for advice. They are really smart and good people, and they are the best source of knowledge about what's going on in any place on Iceland.
Is that what you did?
Absolutely, yes. And also I asked them for monitoring, which means whatever you do, if you're traveling by car or by bike, or if you hike, you can ask Search and Rescue Iceland for monitoring your trip. That means they know where you go. They know the dates of the start and finishing of your trip. And at the end of your trip, you have to send a signal, just a simple mobile message that you are alive and you finished. If you fail to do that, well, the search and rescue operation might start. But if you do something, let's say, bold, it's quite wise to ask for monitoring, or at least to send a message to search and rescue headquarters that, hello, I'm coming to Iceland and I'm doing this, and this. I will be walking or biking in this, and this area, and so on and so on. The more you tell them, the better. And they really like to know what people are doing, because, of course, in case of any accident, it's much easier for them to search for the person.
Yeah, that's very smart. People should do that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, you can have some communication equipment with you, but still, it's good for them to know that, for example, you are going to some rarely visited area. So they are at least not only informed, but at least alerted that there is one guy, or there is a group, or you name it, that is visiting some unusual place. So they will keep their heads up for you. Well, of course, it's also nice to say thank you after all and pay a small donation to them when you finish your trip happily.
So you start out on day one hiking, and how long is it before you reach the highland area that you remember from 2016?
3 days. I hiked pretty slowly, but for the first day, I just took my backpack. I left skis and sled and all the luggage in a small hostel in Egilsstaðir. This is the biggest town on the east of the country. And I could walk the 25 kilometers from the coast to Egilsstaðir back on my foot, just with a small backpack. I spent the night in town, and the next morning, I just put all my equipment on sled and I started to walk. The roads were full of snow. There was like a blizzard during that day, so I could easily walk along the roads. And after 2 days from Egilsstaðir, I reached the edge of the plateau of the highlands. That was the day 4 was the day when I needed to climb, and that was really tough climb, a few hundred meters up, hauling my sled. But once I reached the level of 600-700 meters above sea level, I knew I'm on the level of the highlands. From that moment, you are completely alone, and you really you are on your own.
I think you are counting on your memory from 2016 to help guide you, but how different does it look in winter than in the summer?
I didn't really recognize any places on the highlands, which are, in fact, the huge plateau that is dotted with mountains and hills, and sometimes cut by glacial rivers. Everything was covered with snow, and everything was absolutely different. So I could sometimes recognize the biggest marks, like the biggest volcano in the area. But nothing was the same. Nothing was familiar. Everything was, everything was different. And the snow and ice and the temperature changed everything.
And how are you navigating?
First thing first, navigation equipment was crucial for me. And also, safety and communication equipment was crucial for me. So it was a kind of redundancy. But I took 3 different means of navigation equipment. First, maps and compass. Highlands of Iceland are pretty flat, so you don't really need a very detailed map to navigate there. I've been using one simple map of highlands and another map, a little bit bigger, that covered all the country, including coastal zone. And that was all. 2 paper maps and compass. That's the basic means of my navigation. But in case of bad weather, when you really don't want to deal with paper maps, I was carrying electronic navigation. And the basic one was my Suunto watch, which is very small, which is just a watch with GPS. But before going to Iceland, I uploaded 12 or something tracks to my watch. And these were the tracks I was following all the way from east to the west. And they were also tracks of, I call them evacuation routes. in case of any accident, I was able to start walking towards north or south from the center of the country. So most of the time I was relying on just a simple watch, which means, for example, during the blizzard, when I couldn't see anything, I was just constantly looking on my watch, like every 50 meters, and I was following my track. And also I had a second small Garmin GPS. Unfortunately, I lost it at the second half of this trip by some accident. I don't really understand where it was, but yeah, it's been lost. It's not a big financial loss, but it would be nice to have it. But in general, for this kind of cases, I had three different means of navigation, and I also had the three means of communication device, which was simple mobile phone. I was surprised to find the mobile reception pretty often on the highlands. It was satellite phone, and it was spot messenger. So all of these things were crucial. So I had backup equipment for the communication and navigation.
When you're on the highlands, is the landscape from east to west, the terrain, largely the same, or does it change as you move west?
It changes a little bit. Of course, you have, at the beginning, you have 3 days of coastal zone. Then you have about 1 or 2 days of long valleys. And then you have highlands. Highlands are a big plateau, which is elevated about 600-800 meters above sea level. And it's dotted with mountains and hills. And there were mostly hills mixed with flat valleys, I would say that. But it's not constantly the same landscape. Sometimes the hills disappear, and you find yourself among the lava fields, which are full of rocks, boulders, and gravel. Sometimes very unpleasant place for a walk and hauling your sled. It's more like a labyrinth when you need to navigate very carefully. Especially gravel was bad for the sled. In the street center of Iceland, on the footsteps of glaciers, I didn't cross glaciers, but I was walking just 1 kilometer from one of them. There are also giant, huge, completely flat areas when walking can be really, really easy, but you have to be careful of giant rivers that occur there. So the landscape is not really changing from, I wouldn't say that the east is different from the west, but every day you can find different types of landscape that is changing sometimes day by day.
So these rivers that you spoke of, are they frozen?
Well, this is the main risk factor. And there is particularly big and wild area. It's called Sprengisandur. It's located exactly in the middle of Iceland, north from the Hofsjökull glacier. And while walking there, I would meet a few really big rivers which have no bridge. This is a crucial point. While walking north to the south, you are walking along the rivers. Walking east to the west, you have to cross rivers, sometimes a few times a day. The smallest rivers are the streams. Small and medium rivers are covered with snow, so sometimes you don't really see them at all. But the biggest ones they are just mighty giants, which are going sometimes in a small canyons. And sometimes it would be impossible to cross them. Few rivers on the east and west do have bridges. The problem is the Sprengisandur plain, exactly in the middle, like I told you, where the rivers are wild and there are no bridges at all. And that was possibly the most difficult and dangerous place I could cross. How
did you safely navigate that?
You mean the rivers, crossing the rivers?
Did you find a way to go around, or did you somehow safely manage to go through?
Well, I didn't really try to go through.
You just bypassed.
I bypassed them, and walking there in summer 2016, the season was pretty warm, and the rivers had really high levels. So the wardens of National Park told me that it's not possible to cross them by any chance. My choice was trying to cross it, which was absolutely risky, because if the river would take you, you are technically dead. You can try to cross the glacier, but it's full of crevasses and you're alone. So in that time, my decision was to walk out 50 kilometers to the north to find the first bridge. And during last winter crossing, my decision was also to go north to find a bridge. Because of this short moment of high temperatures, the rivers were also pretty high. And I could see how unstable the snow bridges on the big rivers are. I was sometimes scared to walk across the small river, and across the big one, absolutely no chance.
So when you're out there, are you having any issues with your motivation to keep going day after day?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And of course, it's on every through hike, on every trip, I have to a little bit fight with myself. But there is one way I keep up myself motivated. I call it a Milestones method. I don't really think about how to get to the, let's say, west coast of Iceland. I don't really think how to make another 1, 2, 3, 500 miles to reach my goal. All I think is about present day and present day only. My only goal during this kind of trip was to survive the day and to safely navigate till the end of the day to the evening camp. And if I could do that, then I just fall asleep. I woke up next day and told myself, okay, my goal is to move 20, 25 kilometers to the west, and this is all. I didn't really think about going to West Coast. I was focused on the present day. I use this method pretty often, and it worked really well.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good name, the milestone method.
Yes, and I sometimes use milestones which are a few days apart from each other. But at the end of the day, it's a question of doing not a very big hike. It's a question of doing just 3-5 days, or maybe even just one day. And if you can do that, then you can do another day, and another, and another, and another, and so on till the end.
What happens when you get to the end of the hike?
Nothing. That was the thing. I don't really feel any huge emotions like, the explosion. There is no enlightenment there. This is the thing I learned during my trips. You have to cherish every day, because at the end of this trip, there is nothing. And I think that in this way, the through hike or the trip like that is a perfect, metaphor of your life. The end is not your goal. The end is not the most important thing, because in this way we should hurry up to finish our life. No, the present day and the present moment is absolutely the most important. So if you ask me, what was my favorite moment, I try to cherish days, every day with sunny and calm weather. I try to be grateful for that. And the end is just a landmark, but it doesn't mean anything. The all important things are happening during your trip. And this is something I learned already from the past.
What do you see out there for wildlife?
Nothing. And I will be absolutely honest. I was really amazed to see a small bird, probably 2 weeks after I started. It was in a really geographical center of Iceland, close to Hofsjökull Glacier, 100 kilometers from the coast. And on the huge snowy plain, I could see the bird, and that was amazing. Because when you are there, even during summer, there's pretty nothing. You see some small patches of grass, but you don't really hear the birds. You don't really see no big animals. Absolutely nothing. Because, of course, there is no food and there is no way to survive for a long time inside Iceland. Which means when you go there, especially in winter, you really don't see any living creature, which means you're really very alone.
What would you say is the biggest thing that you've learned from this expedition?
There was no one main lesson, but plenty of small, I think. I gained huge winter experience. I recognized my strength and my weakness and my limits. So if I would go for the next polar adventure, there are many small hints and tips that I took from this winter Iceland trip. So I don't really know if I would do that again. I mean, polar trip. But what I know is, first, I know how many things I still need to learn and to master. That's the first thing. And the second is, after that adventure, it would be much easier for me to survive something bigger, harder, and longer. So no one main lesson, but plenty of small.
What's one thing that you would change if you were to do it again?
Well, definitely sled and hauling system. I was using Paris, which is very, very cheap and popular kind of pulka, the sledge, but it's not rigid enough for rocks and ice. And also hauling system. I was using simple rope, but in this moment, if you are going just a little bit downhill, the sled is hitting you from the back. I would need stiff hauling system, definitely. I would also change some smaller things like cooking system a little bit, or take a tent with vestibule, but these were like smaller things. Sled and hauling system was crucial. Definitely, I would take more coffee to my next trip.
What about chocolate?
I ate plenty of it. I started with, I think, 8 kilograms of chocolate, and that was not enough, I have to say. Yeah.
8 kilograms. My gosh, that is a lot of chocolate.
And I was eating 2 or 3 chocolate bars proper, 200 or 300 grams of chocolate every day. And I would take even more if I could. So, yeah.
Well, that's good advice. If someone else wanted to do this type of an adventure, do you have any other advice that you would want to give them?
There could be many, like hundreds of advices. The only thing I consider crucial is a slow learning curve. I mean, just start from a weekend trips, then continue in a longer and longer. Try to learn and not to dive in the really, really deep water. There are examples of people who tried to do Iceland crossing or do some Iceland adventures in winter, and they had to be rescued just because they didn't have enough experience. And I don't really consider myself a very, very experienced polar traveler, but I think I have been using all my lifetime knowledge and experience and strength and motivation during this trip. So I would really recommend to learn on the shorter trips first, then maybe visit Iceland, maybe in summer, maybe in winter, but the shorter visit on Iceland could help a lot, and then trying to do something like that.
What do you have coming out of this for like a media? Are you going to make like a little movie? Did you take a movie camera with you and do any recording?
Yes, absolutely. And pictures and movies are probably the most important, like the outcome. Of course, besides my own emotions and experience. But I always carry a camera, and yes, I'm going to make a movie. Of course, what I do right now, during last years, I was doing probably hundreds of public presentations after my trips. This time, while everything is closed and people keeping distance from each other, it's not possible. Still, I have a hope that I'll be able to use my pictures during some public events, but also to make a movie. I'm not sure how long will it take, because I have some other things like writing a book from my previous trips. But yeah, I hope this year, but I cannot tell more exact date. Some short movie will be available from this crossing.
I wanted to talk to you about your books because you've written 2 books. One is called Emptiness of Great Silence, about your 2004 Carpathian trip. And the other one is called Walking to Iranian Nomads, about your Zagros 76-day adventure in Iran. First of all, are those available in English?
Unfortunately, not. Oh. They are only in Polish. And I am sorry about this, but this kind of books, I'm not sure if they could find an interest among publishing houses abroad. I would be absolutely happy if that would happen. But until now, they are available only in Polish language.
Have you ever considered self-publishing?
Yes, and I was trying self-publishing of this first title before I found a professional publisher. But translating, I will be honest, I never really considered English translation of those books. So I'm not sure. Maybe one day. I don't want to say no, but right now, sorry, I don't have such a plans, unfortunately.
Well, what do you enjoy most about writing?
The end of it. I mean, it's a process. I'm not a writer from my really deep passion. There are some people that are playing with words and sentences. There are people that I think are natural born writers. I'm afraid I'm not one of them. So I would say I don't really consider myself an artist, more like a skilled craftsman. So I don't really have like a huge talent for writing. It's more the thing that I was training. And from that time, I could make part of my living from writing. What I really like is not the fact of writing itself. I think it's the moment when I am holding my book and when I can share my experience with other people. And I think this second part of that work, which means the contact with your readers, sharing experiences and exchanging your emotions, there and mine, is my favorite about writing books and articles or publishing on the internet. So I think what most important things in writing are after writing for me.
Lukasz, what's next for you?
Difficult question. For a very long time, I was traveling solo, and most of my trips and all my Thru-hikes have been done solo. For the first time, I was planning to do trip with my friends, and it should happen in July and August. We were planning to go to the 7,000 meter summit, maybe 2 or 3 of them in Central Asia. This is a region where you don't have really many formalities and red tape. You don't really have expensive permits like in Nepal. And the mountains of Central Asia, like Pamir, are absolutely beautiful. The problem is like a virus pandemic, and we are not sure what will happen during next month. Of course, we still have time. We plan to start the last day of June. But yeah, we are monitoring the situation very carefully. And it's possible, I would be really sad, but it's possible that we will not go. In this situation, I will consider maybe staying in Poland and writing another book, or do something else, something smaller, to maybe change direction. But the plan for now is Central Asia and high mountain climbing in Pamir Mountains.
How can people find you online if they want to learn more?
The very best ways are via email, which is on my website, Lukasz@lukaszsupergan.com, or the direct message on my Facebook. That's the easiest channel to get in touch with me.
And your website is spelled LukasszSupergan.com.
Exactly.
Łukasz Supergan, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us the story of your 2020 crossing of Iceland and sharing all your many years of experience of thru-hiking. It's been really fun to talk to you. Thank you very much, and best of luck to you in the future.
And my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again for listening. This episode was recorded on April 2nd, 2020. To send me feedback, you can write to me at paul@thepursuitzone.com, or if you want to leave me a voice message, you can go to speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. The best way to support the podcast is to subscribe and share this episode with your friends. For the subscription links, show notes, and more, visit thepursuitzone.com.